change your world. It's time to let it go. The things you used to think, the things you used to know, they don't help you anymore. It's time to change your mind if it's peace you want to find.
This is Kurt Kaikonen, pastor of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, at your neighborhood church. Today on Change Your World, we'll be in the book of Matthew. So grab your Bible and let's get started.
It's time to change your world. You need to let it go. Oh, oh.
Because you can't be right with God and be sinning against your brother. And Jesus isn't saying don't give an offering, but he says get yourself right first so that your offering is accepted. And so when you come to this realization about your sin, Jesus is also saying that you need to go and you need to do this quickly, because the longer you wait, the greater the bondage will be for you. And there's a lot of suffering that you can have. And a prison, we all have a prison in our mind where we will keep taking the same thing and the same hurts, and we'll just go over and over and over. So our minds can be these prisons because we haven't done right, or we haven't repented, and we haven't taken care of sins that we have against others. And he's saying there is a judge coming, but it's not Judge Judy. But if you make peace with your adversary before the judge comes, there will be nothing to judge. And then Jesus, he goes on and he says again, you have heard it said of those of old, you shall not commit adultery. And so Jesus is starting again about what they have heard, which is the interpretation of their leaders of what they had taught them about adultery. And what they had taught, what the Pharisees had taught about adultery, that the act was wrong, but not the heart of the act. And Jesus here again isn't saying that adultery in the heart is the same thing as the act. Or since you lusted in your heart, you might as well go out and commit the act. But what Jesus is addressing is the Pharisees' self-righteousness. Because if you're lusting to satisfy an inner desire, and even though you don't commit the act of adultery, it's still sin, and it still breaks the law, even if you haven't acted on it physically. And adultery, just like murder, it's always committed in the heart before it's ever carried out physically. And the sin of adultery, it's never an accident, but it always occurs in a person's heart first. And so then Jesus, he gives us a remedy. And this remedy, it sounds absurd. And it's the suggestion of cutting off your right hand or plucking out your right eye, as if that's what caused you to sin. But Jesus isn't asking us to do that, because that's never what causes us to sin. What causes us to sin is our hearts. And how do you pluck out a heart? Because sin is not just external, like the Pharisees are making it out to be. Sin is internal. So it's not just what we do or how we physically behave. It's who we truly are in our hearts, because we are sinners. And we don't just sin because we were just acting a little bad, but we sin because we're sinners. So we are just acting out our nature. But as Christians, we have a new nature. We've been given Christ's nature, the nature of Jesus. So we don't have to sin. But even though we have this new nature, we still have that old nature. But if you don't know Christ, you only have that old nature. And that's all you have is a sin nature. So all you can do is sin. And so when you see a sinner sinning, he's just doing his job. You should never be surprised. But as Christians, we don't have to sin any longer, because we have a choice of what nature we'll obey. And there's another point that Jesus makes with his saying of the cutting off of your hand and the plucking out of your eye, is that when it comes to sin, you need to be ruthless. You need to take action, and it needs to be immediate, and it has to be drastic. Sin has to be dealt with harshly. So if you have things around your life that cause you to sin, cut them off and have no mercy about it, because it's not worth the greater price you'll pay. And I'm not saying this, but Jesus is saying hell here. And someone in this culture of back there in these days, they could have thought, and they probably did think, well, I never committed adultery. I always divorced my wives before I was ever with any other woman, because many of them were misinterpreting Deuteronomy 24:1, and they interpreted it as God giving them permission to divorce their wives. And there was a practice among the Jews that a husband could divorce his wife if he found any uncleanness in her. And that word in Hebrew for uncleanness is nakedness. And it doesn't really mean that it's a sexual sin, but it means like how we would say something like it was a shameful thing. And so the Jews, they had two rules of thought about divorce. And one was a lax view, and it was taught by Rabbi Hillel, where a husband, he could divorce his wife for almost anything. And the examples that you read are like burning the breakfast, or that maybe she changed and she's not as attractive, or she didn't have any children. And this, of course, because it was the easy view, it also became the popular view because it worked for them, because you could live however you wanted. And the second view was from Rabbi Shammai. And he said that a husband could only divorce his wife for a sexual sin. But the law never permitted divorce for adultery or any type of sexual sin like that, because the penalty for those sins was always death. But there was one thing that you get that was required through the law of Moses, that when a wife would be sent away, that she would always be sent away with a certificate of divorce. And that certificate was to protect the woman so that she would be able to remarry again. But what Jesus is revealing here and what he's clarifying is that it was never God's intention for any marriage to be divorced. Divorce was just a concession because of their hard hearts. So Jesus, he clears up this misinterpretation of uncleanness or nakedness, because what Jesus does here is he uses a totally different word. And he uses a Greek word, and the Greek word he uses is the word porneia. And that's where we get our word porn from. And so the root of this word means fornication. And so what Jesus is emphasizing here is that marriage, it's permanent. And this stood against the contemporary Jewish culture of that day and the contemporary Greek culture of that day. And then Jesus goes on to saying that an illegitimate divorce is actually adultery. And that's because God doesn't recognize the divorce. And he sees the new relationship as bigamy, because God, he still considers them as married. And I know this is a sensitive topic, and there's a lot of divorces that really haven't been sanctioned by God. And there's also a lot of victims of divorce, so it wasn't their fault. But I would say that if you find yourself in an uncomfortable spot in this because of a divorce, and you're being honest with yourself, and you find yourself, and you might even find yourself to be in the wrong, you can always get yourself right with God. It just takes real confession and real repentance. And it takes changing your mind about what you did. And you need to agree with God's view of it. And it doesn't mean you have to go back to your old spouse and get remarried to that person again. But you also don't have to be messed up in your head. But you do have to see things the way that God sees them. And you have to remember that all sins are forgivable. And you can go on from here. But these people, they made divorce cheap and they made divorce easy so that they could commit adultery, but not technically. And so then Jesus goes on, and then he talks about them swearing falsely. And when Jesus talks about swearing, he's talking about making an oath, because there are no swear words in Hebrew. About the worst you can call somebody in Hebrew is a dead dog. And even nowadays, if you go to Israel and you hear somebody swearing, they don't swear in Hebrew. They always swear in English. But Jesus is talking about things like where you say, I swear on my mother's grave, or Or I'm telling the truth. I'll put my hands on a stack of Bibles. But Jesus starts again, and he starts with, well, you have heard, because again, this is what they were taught by the Pharisees, but it's not taught in the law. And he's saying this not to the Pharisees, he's saying this to his disciples, that you should never swear falsely, and you should perform your oaths to the Lord. And what Jesus is referring to is Exodus 27, that you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. Because these religious leaders, well, they would never swear by God's name, but they would swear by any other name that they could find. And they would make these great oaths, and they would swear by all these crazy things. And they would say, well, I didn't swear by the Lord's name, so my oath is not binding. And so they'd make these long, intricate oaths. And you can go through that list there about all these things they would say, that this is binding and this is not binding. But Jesus just simply tells his disciples, don't make oaths at all, because you don't have control over the things of even your own life, like even the color of your hair. But we know that people have that kind of control nowadays. But he's just telling them, you need to keep your word, that your yes is yes and your no is no, and that everything else is of the evil one. Everything else is of the devil. And this doesn't mean that you can't take an oath, like if you're taking like an oath of office, or you're being sworn to tell the truth in a court. But this all really comes down to is that a person, he is only as good as his word. That oaths really don't mean anything. And we should always be wary when someone makes all these promises, and they promise the whole world to us of what they're going to do, and they're making these big, long, intricate things. Because you'll find out that with a lot of words like that, of those kind of promises, that those people usually have a loss of character. They're just trying to charm you. And then Jesus, he goes on to another part of the law that the religious community had been misinterpreting. And Jesus starts again with, you have heard it said, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And Exodus 21:24, it does teach this. But what these religious leaders had done with it is they had made it a command. But God's intent for that verse was never to be a command. It wasn't meant to be made as a punishment, that you had to make an exact retribution and carry that out specifically that way as a punishment. God's intent was to limit the amount of retribution that civil government could enact. It was given to limit the amount of revenge that could be enforced, that you could only take a tooth or to take an eye. But how they were interpreting it, that it was a personal obligation, that you had to require that amount as a penalty. And if you think about it, of how many people, how they intentionally knocked out like somebody's tooth, and where that injured party, they have no desire to enact that type of punishment on the party that injured them. Like you can imagine it could be like a couple brothers, or father and a son, or a husband and a wife. But they made it a requirement of law. And so Jesus, what he does is he turns this totally around, and he instructs his disciples on how to act. And he tells them, if you're slapped, you don't slap them back. You take it. You turn your cheek. And this type of slap, it's not a beating. This type of slap is just to be considered as an insult. But if someone's going to beat you with a 2x4, Jesus isn't telling you to stand there and take it. That's great bodily injury. That if someone does that, you're supposed to run. But he's saying here that we are to take an insult without insulting somebody back. And then Jesus says, if someone takes your tunic, and what a tunic is, it was your undergarment. It was the clothes that you wore underneath, the one that touched your skin. And these were your regular clothes. And garments in this day, they were expensive because they took a lot of work to produce them. And people didn't have a lot of money. And a lot of people, they only had one. And you could be sued for it. And so your tunic, that garment, well, that could be taken away from you to pay a debt. But Jesus is telling these people that are willing to follow him that if somebody sues you for your tunic, which they could do, that you're to give them your cloak also. And what your cloak was, it was your outer garment. It was your coat. And to people who didn't have much, it was also used as their blanket. And that would be the only thing that they would have to keep themselves warm at night. But you couldn't be sued for your cloak. It couldn't be taken away from you because that was protected in the Mosaic law. And it's written about in Exodus 22:26 and in Deuteronomy 24:13. And so what Jesus is saying, that if they do that, if they sue you for your tunic, that you freely offer your cloak. Just like you freely turn your cheek when you're insulted. And like he's going to say, where you walk a second mile when you're forced to walk 1 mile. Because the Roman soldiers, what they could do is they had the right they'd put their spear on your shoulder or their sword on your shoulder, and they could command you to carry their bags for a mile. And they could do that to any citizen, and they had to. And so what Jesus is telling us is that when we are wronged, instead of taking out our revenge or demanding our rights, we need to have the attitude of suffering that loss ourselves. Because although they can harm us on the outside, they can never harm us on the inside. And this shows everyone our willingness to be able to help sinners, that we want to help them. This ability to overlook these types of wrongs. And when you have that ability and when you overlook it, it's not a sign of weakness. It's a sign of strength. And that's how you try to bring about peace. So we're not supposed to fight every insult or injustice we encounter. We're always supposed to respond kindly and generously. And the reason is because that's God's nature, who's been continually insulted and slandered since the beginning of creation by all people. But he still shows us kindness with his generosity and with his love. And that leads us on to this next part where Jesus says again, you heard it said, because this is what the Pharisees were teaching. You shall love your neighbor, but hate your enemy. And God never said that. God only said, love your neighbor. And that's written in Leviticus 19:18. But they added the other part, hate your enemy. And the Jews, they considered all uncircumcised Gentiles as their enemies. But God, he didn't see these people as their enemies. He saw them all as their neighbors. And the Jews, they were called to love them and to bless them and to do good to them because God, he loves all people. And so Jesus here, he tells us to love our enemies, and he tells us to pray for them and to do good to them no matter how they treat you. And he doesn't say that it will change them, but what he's saying is that it will change us, and you will be like your Father in heaven. And then we're given a really good example of how God does this, of how God loves his enemies and how God blesses his enemies the same way he blesses us. And he blesses them with the blessings of rain and with prosperity and with sunshine and all these wonderful things that we all receive in life. And if you do this, and if you love your enemies, it says here that you're going to get a reward. But if you don't, you won't. And then Jesus uses an example of the most despised person in Jewish culture and in Israel. And he says, if you don't do this, you're no better than a tax collector. Because even the tax collectors, well, they love other tax collectors. And he's saying, you're all called to be better than them because you're called to be perfect like your Father in heaven. And we're supposed to all resemble him because the law never taught to hate your enemies. And you see, for Christians, love has always been expressed here as an act of your will. It's not just the feelings of your emotions. And that word that Jesus uses here about being perfect, it doesn't mean that you're being required to be sinless. It really just means completeness. And it means as children of God, we're supposed to have maturity. We're supposed to act mature. Because our Father in heaven, he loves his enemies, of whom we once were And he wants us to help make his enemies become his children. All right. So if you don't know the Lord and you want to know the Lord, well, we'll pray with you today, because all these things about his people and all these things and the blessings that we do here in the Sermon on the Mount, they're really only for his disciples. They're not really for the people outside, except for like the rain and the prosperity that you can get some of that. So we're still on that hillside with Jesus as he's teaching his disciples, along with those who have been following him, in Jesus' greatest sermon ever, the Sermon on the Mount. And we remember that this is a mixed crowd of Jews and Gentiles, and they're from all over Israel. And so far, Jesus has taught what a disciple or a citizen of heaven, what he should be like, of how his disciples should be in their hearts. And Jesus did this through the teaching of the Beatitudes. And then Jesus, he went on and he taught them not only what they should be like, but he actually taught them what they actually were in this world and what type of an effect that they should have on the world, that they are salt and light. Salt because the world is decaying, and light because the world is in darkness. And Jesus went on to tell his disciples that they need to be more righteous than the scribes and the Pharisees. And then Jesus, he goes through the law with them, and he clarifies between what they've heard and what they've been taught and what's the truth, and how God did not only require an external obedience to God's law, but an internal obedience from each individual's heart, and how the sins of murder and adultery, how they all begin in the heart in the forms of anger and lust, and how we need to deal harshly with sin by immediately cutting it off. And Jesus, he clears up what has been mistaught about God's view on divorce and about taking oaths and on retribution and revenge, and how we are to be able to take an insult without insulting back, and how we're not always to demand our rights, and how we're to be kind and to be generous with those people who oppress us and the ones that mistreat us, and that we're not only to love our neighbors, but we're to love our enemy, and how that makes us like our Father in heaven, because that's how he is. And these people, they've never heard anything like this before, and they had absolutely no idea that God thought this way. And they're learning that God has always thought like that. They just never knew it. And today, a lot of people, they think that the God of the Old Testament is different than what we see in Jesus in the New Testament, that there's like two different gods. But he's not. It's just that Jesus reveals to us how God has always been and how he is. Because everything that we do see in Jesus is exactly the same as God the Father. But up until now, nobody has ever revealed such marvelous truths until Jesus revealed them. And we would have never learned these truths by just observing the world and by the way that people treat each other. These truths have been lost since the beginning of creation, until Jesus revealed them to us again.
You need to change your world. You need to let it go.
Thanks for listening to Change Your World. Change Your World is an outreach of Calvary Chapel, Waterford, and your neighborhood church. If you're listening to Change Your World in the Detroit metro area, why don't you join us for church this Sunday? Our service time is 10 a.m. at Calvary Chapel, Waterford, 183 South Winding Drive, Waterford, Michigan. We're competing with the Catholics. It's only an hour. All the donuts you can eat, and you don't have to believe a thing we say, but it could change your world.
You need to change your world.
The rest of today's message can be heard at yourneighborhoodchurch.org. So check us out and download the app. And until next week, remember,